Brilliant. If everyone can hear me. Yep. Great. Hi, everyone. Hope you're well and safe. My name's Nathan Lawson. I'm the president of the Oxford Climate Society, and I'm a geography student at the University of Oxford, specialising in human and environmental geography. So the Oxford Climate Society is part of Oxford University, aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our award-winning School of Climate Change, which is now teaching over 1,400 people from all over the world. We also run the world's largest student climate journal, Anthroposphere, and we're currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and incorporate climate change into the curriculum. The theme of today's event is the Green New Deal, prospects for a low carbon future. So the Green New Deal is a holistic proposal to directly address the climate crisis through a set of tangible policies that ensures a just transition from a predominantly fossil fuel-based society to a net zero one. Inspired by Roosevelt's 1930s recovery strategy after the Great Depression, the Green New Deal gives a broad set of policies that directly offers an alternate future that's more sustainable and congruent with the planetary boundaries, whilst also lifting people out of poverty through the provision of green jobs. This provides a host of technical, economic, social, and political challenges to make this fast shift and avoid even more dangerous levels of climate change in the future. In today's event, we're going to look at three main themes. The first is our economic system, capitalism, asking what needs to change within the capitalist system to facilitate this transition. The second, we'll be discussing, of course, the Green New Deal, looking at the specifics of it and its technical and financial feasibility. And the last aspect that we'll look at is political mobilization. What are the main political challenges that we need to overcome in order to make this transition a reality? So to help us tackle and better understand some of these topics, I'm delighted to introduce our final speaker of the term, Professor Robert Pollin. Professor Robert Pollin is a distinguished university professor of economics and co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also the founder and president of PAIR, which is an acronym for Pollin Energy and Retrofits, an Amherst, Massachusetts-based green energy company that operates throughout the United States. He's also written numerous books, including one co-authored with Noam Chomsky, called The Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal, to which a lot of today's discussion will be based around. And he was also selected by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the 100 leading global thinkers for 2013. So welcome, Robert, to the Oxford Climate Society, and thank you for joining us today. So just to explain the structure of today's event, there are three main parts. We'll start by Robert giving a short speech with his thoughts on this topic before moving to questions from myself. And the last section will be questions from you guys, the audience. So as usual, if you've got any questions, please do pop them in the YouTube live stream. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Robert to give a short speech.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathan, and thank you very much for having me. I am going to use a PowerPoint, and so I hope you can see it okay. Okay. So I'm going to just give an overview of where we are and what I think the solutions need to be. In principle, analytically, I think the basics are actually quite simple. Of course, there's a lot of complicated features, but in the basics, everything, in my view, is pretty straightforward. Okay, first, I want to just frame where we are. And of course, I'm not a climate scientist. I just try to absorb the recent research of the people who actually are doing the climate science. And this most critical report came out in October 2018 by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which is a unit within the United Nations that gathers the research on climate change. And they are definitely not alarmist themselves. They are considered, if anything, somewhat conservative in their assessments as to the critical nature of the situation and what needs to be done. In any case, in October 2018, they changed their assessment to say that we needed to stabilize the global mean temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, as opposed to 2 degrees Celsius. That was a major change, suggesting that the destructive features of rising global temperatures were more severe than they had previously assessed, and that we needed to take this action you can see, to prevent more heat extremes, heavy precipitation, droughts, sea level rises, biodiversity losses. Now, in order to stabilize the climate at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, they did lay out some benchmarks, 2 in particular. Roughly speaking, they said that we needed to cut carbon dioxide emissions, CO2, by 50% as of 2030. Now, that's only 9 years from now. Cut by 50% as of 2030, and to establish net zero emissions by 2050. Okay, so those are the 2 goals around which we need to organize any kind of climate stabilization policy. Now, when we say that the alarming, the IPCC alarming report of 2018, what they are looking at are the data that you're looking at now, which shows us the trajectory for global mean temperature changes from 1870 to 2000. And so this 0 line here represents the global mean temperature pre-industrial levels, meaning basically before the Industrial Revolution, so around 1800. And as you can see, until 1940, there was no trajectory of global warming at all. We start to see upticks in the global mean temperature around 1940, but not it is not consistent. And it's really only at around 1980, as you can see, that we began to see this persistent upward rise in the global mean temperature, with the figure at 2020 essentially matching the 2016 experience, which have been the warmest years in the history of recorded evidence on this. So 2020, again, 2016. And where we are, we're already at basically at 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels now. And what the IPCC says is we need to stabilize at no more than 1.5 degrees. Obviously, if we continue this trajectory, we will smash the 1.5 degree trajectory very quickly. I mean, we've already gone, it was at 0.5 degrees, it was only 20 years ago. Okay, so if we keep at this trajectory, you know, basically we're doomed. This is what we're talking about, ecological disaster. Only 10 days ago, the United Nations put out its synthesis report by another related organization, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I'm just quoting you here from the summary of that document by the UN Secretary General Guterres, who, as you can see, says 2021, this year, is a make or break year to confront the global climate emergency. Okay, the science is clear, as I just described to you. Now, the critical thing that the report from 2 weeks ago says is that we're at a red alert moment. Quote, it shows governments are nowhere close to the level of ambition needed to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Nowhere close. In fact, if you look at some of the best models as to where emissions are going, even under the global Paris Agreement, by 2040, emissions continue to rise. They don't go down at all, much less hit a 50-degree contraction, much less net zero by 2050. So that's the nature of the problem we face. Okay, so what to do about it? Well, even though we are in this severe critical stage in terms of rising global mean temperatures, in my view, again, what to do about it is actually very straightforward and actually achievable. Number one, we have to transform the global energy system. Well, now that sounds like a gigantic, overwhelming project, but it's actually quite viable. So why do we have to transform the global energy system? Well, because burning fossil fuels, burning oil, coal, and natural gas to produce energy is the main source of climate change. It's responsible for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are in turn the source of global warming. So we just have to stop burning fossil fuels. That's straightforward. There's no way around it. We just have to stop. Now, if we think of it as a 30-year project, and we start cutting now, the cuts are significant, but they're not going to be overwhelming. For the first several years, we're looking at 3 to 4% reductions per year, which is eminently achievable. Of course, percentage-wise, the cuts are going to get bigger over time. But at the same time, what we're then going to do is build in this positive alternative clean energy system based around energy efficiency and clean renewable energy. By energy efficiency, I mean in buildings, making buildings much more efficient. Buildings are the biggest source of energy consumption almost everywhere in the world. Transportation systems, that means expanding public transportation. That does mean electric vehicles. Industrial production, that means using combined heat and power as opposed to flaring the heat when we run machines. We use that as a high source of energy efficiency. Then we need to build out renewable energy: solar, wind, geothermal, small scale hydro, and low emissions bioenergy. The work I've done with co-authors, we estimate that the investment costs here would be about 2.5% of global GDP per year. GDP meaning all economic activity, gross domestic product or gross global product. So it means 97.5% of global activity does not have to be in building a clean energy global system, but 2.5% does need to be. And we are at about 0.5% now. So we need to expand that by about 2 percentage points. Number two, we need to transform the global agricultural system. Why do we need to do that? Because our existing agricultural practices are responsible for the other 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So 70% energy system, 30% agricultural system. And in terms of the agricultural system, the sources of emissions are expanding CO2 and other greenhouse gases, meaning mainly nitric oxide and methane. Number one is deforestation, because trees absorb CO2. You chop down the tree, you release the CO2. And then you also don't have the trees to absorb. So we need to reverse deforestation. We need to contract cattle farming, because cattle farming is the biggest source of demand for land that in turn requires deforestation. In industrial agriculture, using nitrogen fertilizer to produce food is very efficient in terms of producing food. It does generate a lot of food, but it also produces CO2 emissions, methane, and nitric oxide. So we need to transition out of industrial agriculture into organic agriculture, and we need to stop wasting so much food. We waste something like 20 to 30% of all the food we produce, both in poor countries and in rich countries. In poor countries, we need to improve storage. That's the main reason why we waste food, even in poor countries. Okay, what is this at? Why do we call this the Global Green New Deal? Well, Nathan already gave us the sense of it. The New Deal in the United States from the 1930s was the program that President Roosevelt advanced in order to fight the 1930s depression. And it was not just a program to reverse the deep economic crisis, but to advance egalitarianism as a means of getting out of the crisis. So this is why we use the term New Deal to evoke the experience of the 1930s in the United States. And we call it the Green New Deal because we have to combine the climate stabilization and other environmental goals along with the egalitarian transition. Now, okay, why is the climate stabilization program compatible with egalitarianism? Again, Nathan already gave us the answer. I'll pretty much repeat what he just said. First and foremost, investing to build a green energy system and a green agricultural system are going to be generating millions of jobs, actually tens of millions of jobs. In fact, on a global scale, hundreds of millions of jobs. And I've done research myself with co-authors in many countries in all regions of the world. And we show this over and over again, that building the green economy is going to expand job opportunities. It creates 2 to 3 times more jobs than were we to say, okay, we're going to just maintain our existing energy infrastructure. No, that maintaining the existing energy infrastructure is an impossibility anyway on the basis of climate change, but you will get a huge expansion of job opportunities. Secondly, advancing the Global Green New Deal is going to improve public health because it reduces pollution. And in fact, the severity of pollution, especially in developing economies, has created severe health impacts during COVID because it has compromised people's lungs, and therefore it has exacerbated the problems caused by COVID. The Green New Deal will create opportunities for alternative ownership forms, because if we move into small-scale energy systems, smaller scale agricultural systems, that opens up opportunities for cooperative and community ownership forms that do not exist under big-scale, utility-scale energy or big-scale corporate agriculture. And finally, this is critical and a surprise maybe, we will lower energy costs. It'll be cheaper to run a global economy based on clean energy as opposed to our existing fossil fuel system. Why? Well, number one, because we're going to invest in energy efficiency. So that means it's cheaper to get from point A to point B because we have more efficient systems. Or it's cheaper to run heating and cooling in buildings. And secondly, critically, the costs of clean energy have been coming down while the costs of fossil fuel energy are rising. Even in the United States, a report just came out last month that the cost of solar energy or wind energy to produce a kilowatt of electricity is half that of coal or nuclear power, half. This is from the US Energy Department. The work had to have been done under President Trump. So even under President Trump, the Energy Department came out with this finding. Now, the Global Green New Deal must include, also as Nathan said, a just transition program for fossil fuel dependent workers and communities. There will be losers. Communities will be hurt that are dependent on coal, oil, natural gas, and therefore this has to be integrated into the system. Okay, finally, how do we pay for this in an egalitarian way? I do discuss it, and thank you, Nathan, for mentioning the book with Noam Chomsky. And we talk about how to finance it. Basically, again, it's pretty straightforward. You all have probably heard about carbon taxes. So you just, yes, you tax consumption of oil, coal, and natural gas, but you have to rebate most of the revenue back to people, or else this becomes a very, what we say in economics, regressive tax. It hits lower income people more than other people because proportionally they spend more on energy. And that's what happened in France when President Macron tried to introduce a carbon tax, and it created the yellow vest movement in opposition because they said, this is going to, we can't put food on the table. So you do a carbon tax to discourage fossil fuel consumption. You give most of the money back to people. Some of it you keep for the clean energy investments. Second, you transfer money from military budgets. And the biggest military budget by far is the United States. So that will be an egalitarian transfer. Third, we think about bond purchases by the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. Look, in the Federal Reserve, since a year ago, March 2020, with the onset of the COVID pandemic, has purchased about $3 trillion of bonds on Wall Street to bail out Wall Street. I'm thinking the Fed needs to do about one-tenth of that or less in order to finance this project. And finally, we do have a large-scale system globally of fossil fuel subsidies. Well, yeah, eliminate those fossil fuel subsidies, but we can't just cut them out because they actually are a way to actually produce low-cost energy to low-income people. So we transfer those into clean energy subsidies. So those are the basics. Again, it's straightforward. I'll stop here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robert, for that. That was incredibly holistic run through. Very, very talented to get through that in 15 minutes. Entirely new, potentially political outlook. So the first, as I mentioned in the introduction, the first area that I'm going to focus on.
Should I take off the screen?
Yeah, that'd be best if you can. Perfect. Okay, so the first area I want to talk about is our economic system, elephant in the room, capitalism. And I just really want to get clarity on what your position is. It's undeniable that capitalism isn't working for the vast majority of people, whether it be for the reasons of vast inequality, both at international and national scales, or the evident environmental degradation. So I think where the debate lies now is to ask whether we can afford, do we have the time for systemic change given the temporality, if I can get my words right, of climate change? And if not, if we can't afford that, what are the specific modifications to our current economic system that we need to be more congruent with our planetary boundaries?
Okay, great question. So if we really take the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change goals seriously, and we have to eliminate emissions altogether, or basically by 2050, we don't have that much time to totally transform the entire global economic system in every feature of it. So that we're going to have to operate within the interstices of capitalism. We have to transition out of the existing form of capitalism into something different. And maybe we will call it something else at the end of the transition. But we have to start where we are. So the kinds of things that I'm talking about, okay, we can't run a fossil fuel industry anymore. Okay, that has to wind down. And I noticed the head of ExxonMobil, just I think day before yesterday, said, oh yeah, I agree, we have to be at net zero emissions by 2050. Well, that means what they do can't be done anymore. They're going to have to lose their fossil fuel assets. And if they were smart, they would start investing in alternative energy. So we can't run a fossil fuel energy system. We can't keep chopping down the Amazon forest, and therefore we can't do cattle farming to the extent we're doing it. So those are some specific things that we absolutely have to stop. Within that framework, capitalism can still function. I mean, if we're talking about capitalism as a system of private property dominant system in which people are self-interested and so forth, that is going to continue. It's going to have to be, it'll have to operate under different rules. Now, as I said, one of the opportunities that will happen out of the green energy transition is the opportunity for alternative ownership forms. So we can have a different kind of capitalism with private co-ops, private community ownership. We can have public ownership mixed in, and those things can emerge on a small scale that wouldn't be possible under our existing fossil fuel system. But I'll also just mention one thing. If public ownership is the solution to climate change, we've already solved it, because 90% of the world's fossil fuel assets are owned publicly. They're owned by governments. So the mere fact of having public ownership does not mean we have solved anything. So it's not just a matter of going from a private dominated economic system to a public sector dominated economic system. Obviously, that's not enough of a solution. We need to have a transition that hits the specifics that I talked about: clean energy, agricultural transition.
Brilliant, great. And then just building on that, those points. So specifically, within capitalism is the prioritization of profits and growth. But in your book, you say that clearly we need growth in renewable sectors and energy efficiency. So growth, in that sense, or per se, is not necessarily a bad thing. On the other hand, as you've also explained, when financial growth, in the neoliberal form, and profit is prioritized over human and environmental costs, then of course you can have widespread, issues. So, what do you think about the whole growth versus degrowth sort of debate, and specifically also the need to decouple environmental growth from environmental degradation? Could you just expand on that a little bit for us?
So I guess, you say degrowth versus growth debate. And I guess you could say I'm one of the participants in that debate. And I've been critical of the degrowth position. I want to first say, though, that I respect the degrowth proponents. I think they're raising a lot of points that are absolutely valid about the problems that emerge with growth, especially under, as you said, under neoliberalism, under our current variant of capitalism, where basically the prerogatives of corporations predominate over everything else. That said, I don't think that degrowth doesn't get us to a solution, because of the reasons you just said. Actually, we need a massive expansion of the clean energy system. So do we call that growth or do we call that degrowth? Call it whatever you want. If people are going to be able to consume energy to light their homes, to travel, to operate machines, we need energy. And energy makes, when it is well distributed, fairly distributed, makes lives better. So I don't want to think about us imposing austerity on people's livelihoods. I want to think of this as a framework through which we expand people's life opportunities. So, for example, in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, half the people have no access to electricity, zero, despite promises by politicians forever. So if you have small-scale clean energy systems, you are massively growing their access to energy, growth, and you are massively improving their life opportunities. So that's what I see as the opportunities available through a Green New Deal. And I don't think that sense is captured adequately in what we call a degrowth agenda. That said, I mean, I know the literature, and most things with the degrowth proponents, I'm in large agreement.
Great. Brilliant. And building on the theme of neoliberalism, I just want to talk about the globalization debate for a second. So one of the effective neoliberal policies and doctrine has been to globalize the world economy and reduce the barriers for international trade. And Naomi Klein highlights this relationship in her book. And yeah, so I just wanted to get, where do you stand on this sort of debate, given the contribution that such neoliberal policies have in contributing to climate change, do you think that there needs to be a greater shift in focus on nationalizing and localizing, for example, energy infrastructure rather than importing it from other countries? Where do you sit on this?
Yeah, well, localizing energy would be a natural outgrowth of a clean energy transition because, we have sun and wind and everywhere. And we also can pull up geothermal energy from underground everywhere. So when we think about some work I did, for example, in Puerto Rico, which I did after they suffered from the hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017. And so we think about, and basically they import all their energy, all of it, 100%, and it's very expensive. And all that energy is also contributing to climate change. Where here we have this island where they've got an absolute abundance of both sun and wind. So you can localize the energy system. You can have 100% self-sufficiency in energy obviously in a place like Puerto Rico. You can also have, where I live in Massachusetts, where it's it's a lot colder, we have a lot less sun and wind. We can also have a clean energy system. The building that I work in, we'll go back to it after COVID, it's a net zero emissions building. Every building can be a net zero emissions building everywhere. They're doing it, clean energy systems, community-based clean energy systems in Alaska. So localization, yes, absolutely. On the other hand, I'm not someone who says we should cut off trade. I think there have been benefits of trade. We have to think of the larger benefits and where people are hurt, just like with the clean energy transition, we need to protect and provide a just transition for the workers and communities. But as I mentioned, the costs of solar energy are much lower now than coal. The main reason that solar energy is cheaper than coal is due to China and exports of solar panels to the rest of the world from China. So should we punish China for lowering solar panels and the cost of solar energy by 80%? No, I think we should recognize China's quite considerable achievement. If the US or the UK want to compete with China, fine, let's keep lowering it. Fight it out, guys, and keep lowering the cost. But we can't shut off these solar panel imports from China. They've been critical to the success, such as it is, in building a clean energy economy.
Great, thanks for that. So we'll move on now to the second part. So discussing sort of the practicalities of the Green New Deal. So the first one that's probably on everyone's mind is that last slide that you showed of how we're gonna pay for it. So to specifically focus on the military budget, how politically feasible do you think it is? Right, I agree with you that we spend a lot of money on the military, but given for example the rising tensions between US and China, do you think that it's going to be justifiable to divert some of that military spending to a lot of people that you need to convince in government?
Great question. So exactly the reason why I laid out those alternatives was to make it all politically feasible, so that the extent to which we're talking about any one of them, the carbon tax, the cuts in military spending, the cuts in fossil fuel subsidies, or the elimination of the fossil fuel subsidies and the green bond financing, in all cases, the magnitude of the transitions are actually pretty small. What I was talking about in terms of military cuts is 5%. That should be feasible. It ends up being a lot of money because the United States' military budget is $750 billion. Right? So, we get a lot of money even from a 5% cut. The green bond program, the way I presented it, I made it, basically a trivial amount relative to the possibilities. So I'm talking about, like I said, I think something like 300 billion. As I said, Wall Street alone, the Fed alone has purchased 3 trillion in bonds from Wall Street over the last 12 months, 10 times the amount we're talking about. So it is entirely feasible. Now, if you listen to Christina Lagarde, who's the head of the European Central Bank, she has said repeatedly that she wants to use her powers at the central bank to finance climate transition. The new Treasury Secretary in the US, Janet Yellen, says exactly the same thing. In fact, she's given a new position within the US Treasury to somebody to promote climate financing. Now, whether they're going to follow through and do it to the extent necessary, that's an open question. And those are the things we have to fight for. Lagarde really talks like she's serious. Whether she is, again, the things that they've discussed so far at the European Central Bank, in my view, are nowhere close to adequate. But the rhetoric is great. So what we have to do is push them to match the actual practices with their very committed rhetoric.
Brilliant. And the other funding question I've got is, so carbon tax was another significant proportion. And I just, to sort of suggest a counter argument, do you think it sends perhaps the wrong message that if you're trying to tax something, which is supposed to be a make people deterred from using carbon, do you think it sends the wrong message that that's a fundamental or significant proportion of the funding for the Green New Deal? Do you think there's any criticism there, valid criticism there?
Well, we can go with the carbon tax. We don't have to do actually any of these. We don't have to do the military budget. We don't have to do the carbon tax. We do have to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, absolutely. We do have to have green bond financing, absolutely. An alternative to carbon tax is just a regulation which says you can't burn fossil fuels, that we're going to cut it 5% per year, or the CEOs of the utilities go to jail. How about that? That'll get their attention. The carbon tax, it has the advantage, as you're saying, it still allows burning fossil fuels, but you pay more. The advantage of that is that it does bring in revenue. And so it's a way through which to bring in revenue, to redistribute the revenue. But if we can get the revenue from the other things, I'm fine with it. I'm not absolutely gung-ho committed to a carbon tax per se. That's again, so I have these alternative financing tools, and we can come up with 2 or 3 others. The point is, it's not hard to think of how we get to finance this whole project. If we're really thinking about it in the range of 3% of global GDP, which I think is reasonable. And it's not just me. If we look at other people's research, and people have modeled their programs differently than me, but we come out to more or less the same place, 2-3% GDP. Come on, we can finance. As I said, we just passed a bill in the US Congress yesterday, and that's 10% of GDP. And we passed another one last year that was 10% of GDP. And the Fed's interventions were 15% of GDP. So I'm talking about 3%. It's completely achievable.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, I'm conscious of the time, so we'll move on to our third aspect, so political mobilization. The main one, again, is about political support. So in order to amass enough support for the Green New Deal, you're going to have some sort of agreement across the political spectrum, right? So the question is basically, how do we do this in short terms? And there's also there's an increase in sort of sub-political movements. For example, you talked about eco-socialism. And do you think it's perhaps unhelpful to have so many sub-movements, and rather we should work across these political divides for the Green New Deal?
Well, I don't think it's harmful. I think that in my view, the most helpful thing is to focus on the things that are absolutely necessary that we need to do, and to minimize rhetoric, to minimize unnecessary debates. Of course, there are debates, of course. I don't want to be Pollyannish. We need debates. There are differences. But I think, if we're at the point at which the CEO of ExxonMobil just this week said we have to be at zero emissions, I think we can kind of say we're at a point at which we have close to a global consensus on the need to achieve zero emissions by 2050. How exactly we get there? Yeah, we're going to have some big debates. For example, I'm assuming that the president of the CEO of ExxonMobil is in favor of carbon capture technology, meaning this technology through which you keep burning oil, coal, and natural gas. You capture it before the carbon gets into the atmosphere, you liquefy it, you move it underground, you store it underground forever. That's one variant of carbon capture. Another is you suck it out of the air and convert that to a liquid, and then you can burn it, and so you keep recycling it. So these people, and Bill Gates in his new book is very supportive of carbon capture technology and nuclear power. So I would argue again, I think I'd have a very substantive debate against those things, first and foremost on the grounds that we already have a solution with energy efficiency and safe, clean, cheap, renewable energy. So let's have the debate around that and fight it out, and hopefully we can win that debate. In terms of eco-socialism, I mean, I think I support all the goals of it in terms of moving towards a much more egalitarian system, whether we want to call it socialism or we want to call it social democracy or the Green New Deal. That seems to be a secondary or even a trivial point. So I would focus on the things that absolutely need to be focused on. Stop burning fossil fuels, stop industrial agriculture, stop chopping down forests, and move to a smaller scale, more egalitarian, cleaner system.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So last question for myself before we move to the audience. And this one's about identity politics. So identity politics can be great for highlighting the differential and disproportionate effects of environmental degradation on specific groups within society. However, on the flip side, it can also hinder collectivism among different identities, right? As we see, for example, with the many environmental groups in the global north being criticized for their lack of diversity and not caring for ordinary people can hinder their movement. So how can we elevate identity politics, is my question, in a way that still acknowledges these disproportionate effects, but also increases the widespread support that you've just talked about for the Green New Deal?
So, well, first of all, it is a fact, and I don't think we can call it identity politics, but the impact of environmental degradation impacts lower income communities much more than everybody else. So that's true here in the US. In fact, one of my colleagues, or two of my colleagues, just put out an excellent study on the extent to which the siting of utilities are, much more impactful in low-income communities, and therefore generates negative health consequences in those communities. But it's not just in the global north. I mean, the largest impacts in terms of pollution are now in the global south, where you have cities that are becoming almost unlivable due to pollution, such as New Delhi. These impacts are on the health of low-income people. So whether we call that identity politics, I don't know. In terms of the impact on employment, it is true that most of the jobs in clean energy now, if we look at the profile of who is in those jobs, in the US, it's white males have most of the jobs, because they're construction jobs and manufacturing jobs, a lot of them. And so we have to diversify that. In terms of the impacts on fossil fuel communities, those are also jobs for men, of course, in different countries. They're not white men, but we talk about miners, we talk about people working in the oil industry. So diversification in a clean energy transition will be an opportunity. So we should see that as an opportunity. So we should create affirmative action programs to create opportunity, training programs to move people who have been underrepresented in energy and employment opportunities in general.
Great, and yeah, actually in our human geography course, we were looking at the masculinity around mines, right, and how it's exclusive to women. So yeah, very interesting topic there. Brilliant. So we're going to move on in the last 10 minutes or so to audience questions. They're pouring in. So the first one I'll start off with is, what are the alternatives to using GDP as a measure of economic well-being?
GDP is a really bad measure, but you heard me referring to it. It does capture some things, but it doesn't capture a lot of other things. It certainly doesn't capture environmental damage, starting with that. So, you know, if I buy gasoline and fill up my car and drive 100 miles, that gets counted as part of GDP because the guy that sold me the gasoline registers that as income, and his income is part of GDP. So that's a good. Whereas the pollution that's created by me driving is not counted as a bad. So the first thing would be to incorporate these environmental effects. The second big thing that is not included in GDP is the unpaid labor activity. And you know, this became dramatically apparent during COVID, when there was so much that needed to be done to just take care of people to get through this crisis. And most of it is unpaid labor, labor done by family, labor done by friends, work done within a community. So that is work. So if you know, if I hire a babysitter and pay the babysitter, that's counted as GDP. If I take care of my own children, or actually I have grandchildren, if I take care of them myself, it's not counted as GDP. So that's stupid. So yes, we need to incorporate that. And the third big problem with GDP is, as we talked, it doesn't address distribution at all. So, you know, if the pie gets bigger, that's considered good. But it doesn't say who's getting what shares of the pie. And as we know from neoliberalism, the fundamental attribute of neoliberalism the last 40 years has been massive increases in inequality, exacerbated by the COVID crisis. And so that doesn't get captured at all by GDP. All of those things, environmental impacts, unpaid labor, distribution, should be incorporated in a much better measure of aggregate economic activity.
Great. Next one is urbanization, which is accelerating, going to make the necessary societal changes easier or harder to achieve?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
So they're talking about, is urbanization, right? Which is accelerating,
yeah, okay,
going to make these changes, societal changes, harder or easier to achieve?
Wow, that is such an interesting, good question. It's actually both. Why easier? Well, because urban communities operate more efficiently than rural communities. So in fact, the highest level of energy efficiency in the United States is actually New York City. You wouldn't think of that because there's all these people packed in, but because we have very tall buildings and people are living in apartment buildings, and a high proportion of the people use public transportation, it is far more efficient than, say, the next biggest city in the United States, Los Angeles, which is much more spread out, individual detached family homes. Everybody's driving their cars and stuck in the freeway and wasting energy. So in that sense, if you can build high efficient urban communities, that will make it easier to meet the climate the emission reduction goals. On the other hand, what we've seen in terms of global cities and less developed economies, what we've seen, as I mentioned before, is that you have these massive problems of pollution, and they are not going to get solved until we move out of the existing fossil fuel-based energy system. But in addition to that, people are burning coal or burning wood in their homes just for heating. So in order to transition to clean energy in developing countries, we also have to move them into renewable energy systems. And that actually is easier to do in a more rural setting where you can set up your community solar panel system than in a high density area where we don't have the space. So there will be challenges both ways, but in any case, urbanization is happening. The proportion of people that depend on agriculture for their livelihoods is diminishing. We need to transition to organic agriculture, and then we need to move people into other activities for their livelihoods.
Brilliant. And we've got quite a technical question here. So what makes you prefer carbon taxes over emissions trading combined with border adjustments? And how can the free rider problem be overcome, especially without border adjustments?
So as I mentioned before, it's not that I'm an absolute proponent of carbon taxes. I think it's a useful tool. There's other ways to go. The benefit of a carbon tax, and I didn't talk about carbon tax with cap and trade. I just said the carbon tax. And the reason I didn't talk about a cap and trade system, meaning that you can trade your right to consume fossil fuels in this market where other people are consuming less carbon, you're consuming more, is that it's simpler. My basic critique of a cap and trade system is that it introduces complexity that enables very sharp accountants and lawyers to get around the system, and it makes monitoring the system more difficult. So the simpler the system, the better. And the best thing is to keep making clean energy cheap. And that when we keep making clean energy cheap and accessible, that will alleviate whatever problems we have with a carbon tax system or a trading system. You're on mute.
Classic. Brilliant. I think I'll make this one of my last questions. So what do you think about transition bonds and the claim they are filling a gap in the sustainable market to finance transitional and enabling activities? Is it greenwashing or a credible transition tool?
Well, it depends on what we use the bonds for. And so in my very aggregated proposal, that we say, okay, we use the central bank's powers to create money, basically, and we buy green bonds. Now, of course, when we buy green bonds, we have to be clear that the activity that is being financed is actually reducing emissions. So, we can't buy green bonds that are just going to be greenwashing, meaning engaging in activities that aren't doing any good, that may sound good. We have to do things that actually are going to reduce emissions. So this is why I also think that the kind of what we call renewable portfolio standards are absolute regulations to reduce fossil fuel energy, say for utilities. So they have to reduce it by 5%. They can buy a green bond and that can finance their transition to a clean energy system, but they have to actually do it. They can't just be engaged in some kind of fancy trading mechanism through which they avoid the regulation. So green bonds, yes. Careful regulations and monitoring must be accompanying any kind of green bond transition.
Brilliant. And I don't know if you got my message, Robert. Could you just, I think you're sharing screen. So do you mind just changing to speaker view?
What do you want me to do?
So, oh, brilliant. I think it's done now. Don't worry, ignore me.
Okay.
I think last question, which is it possible to maintain the amenities, consumer options, and holidays? For example, rich people in the global north expect without fossil fuels, given green energy. Okay, that question does not make much sense. I'm going to move to a different one. What's your view on carbon dioxide removal technologies?
Unproven. You know, we may need to get there, and let's see where we are in 20 years. But right now, we have technologies that are available to us, that are affordable, and that are going to be the foundation for a future clean energy system. So let's focus on building up renewables, solar, wind, massively increasing energy efficiency. I was just doing a study for the state of West Virginia in the United States, which has the biggest coal sector and has a level of efficiency which is 3 times the energy consumption is 3 times the national average of the US. So the simplest thing in West Virginia is just introduce technologies through which you can at least get to the national average. So let's do energy efficiency and renewables, and let's see where we are in 15 years, and let's see where the carbon removal technologies are. Now, saying that, I would also add that we already do have natural carbon renewable technology, which is planting trees and using organic agriculture instead of industrial agriculture. So those simple technologies, natural carbon removal are fine. But the more technologically advanced versions, they're not proven. And we don't know the extent to which they're going to be needed. So I wouldn't focus on them right now.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the event. So I'd just like to thank you, Robert, again for joining us, and that was incredibly insightful. And as I said, for anyone who hasn't got it yet, I thoroughly recommend reading the latest book with Noam Chomsky. It's an incredibly short and holistic, way to understand the topics that have been talked about today. So as you may know, it's the last event of Hillary term even, and which means it's also the final event of the current committee. So I'm just going to spend a minute or so just quickly highlighting some of the things from this year. So the first thing is just to give credit to the wonderful committee, the OCS committee, that have put hours and hours, behind all of these various initiatives that people have been able to participate in. So I'd like to thank them. SAFA for our events. We've also, been able to interview some of the greatest minds in the climate movement, with the likes of Robert and Noam a couple of weeks ago. For me personally, I've been able to interview the likes of Vandana Shiva, who I massively look up to, and hopefully when I'm a little bit older, be able to live up to her sort of work. The other main thing to highlight is the School of Climate Change, which, when we first started, 1 year ago, it only had about 140 people, predominantly based in Oxford. And now, since the advent of COVID, everything going online, as mentioned in the introduction, it's got over 1,400 people. And this actually, we found out recently, makes it the largest course by intake in Oxford for over 900 years, which is a massive, massive achievement. So again, congratulations to Alexis for making that possible. The other big thing that we've done on a practical thing, because we talk about a lot of these issues, but we also do a lot on the ground, is the Decarbonise Oxford campaign, which was launched just in January and has already brought together students from over 30 of the Oxford colleges to demand that their colleges respond to the climate emergency by setting immediate net zero targets. And the other main thing is that we co-launched OxCam back in September, which is Oxford Climate Alumni Network, which many of the students watching will want to be part of when they graduate. And that's another massive opportunity. And lastly, just moving away from the things on paper, I'd just like to say that there's obviously a lot of contestation in the climate community about how we solve the climate crisis and how we get to net zero, or a more equitable society. And I think now more than ever, we need more dialogue and an ability to listen to people with differing views to our own. I think that's incredibly important in any functioning democracy. And I'm proud that OCS has been, facilitating that process of listening to people with a variety of views. So on that note, I'd just like to, say goodbye. You may not be seeing me again for a little while, and I'll hand over to the new committee. You'll see them in Trinity term in a few weeks' time. So bye from me, and we'll end the live stream here.